about determining the scope of your piece, relaying relevant STEM research, reviewing legislation, understanding stakeholders, shaping a policy recommendation, and then Brittany's going to talk about structuring a memo. So this is just a little snapshot of some of the publications we've put out at the Science Policy Group here at UCLA. They're on a varying ranges of topics, but for instance, locally, the scope we focused on for locally was like water in Los Angeles. We talked about going beyond cash bail, and Yuki also worked on a paper on urban greening. And so these were all papers, policy memos that were discussing local solutions. And then there was one paper that talked about mitigating wildfire in California through housing and zoning policy, and this involved state level recommendations. And then this was a paper I worked on that was on grid resilience. We were focusing on Louisiana, but it had implications for the whole Southeast region. So the scope of that paper was somewhat regional. And then we also had a paper that was focusing on FDA oversight for tear gas. So the suggestions were at the national level. And then we also had one of our members work on the global paper about repealing the global gag rule in relation to reproductive and sexual health. And so overall, when thinking about determining the scope of your policy paper, we came up with these questions. Why is your policy needed? How will your policy address the problem? Who or what is impacted by your policy? Where would this take effect? And who has jurisdiction to make these changes? And what would be required to implement your policy? So to do this, we're gonna do a bit of an exercise based on one of the papers that I worked on. So in determining the scope for establishing grid resiliency in Louisiana and the region of the Southeast US, there were a few things we had to understand, which was that the grid is across the US is pretty centralized, and it's in these, and that means just it's interconnected across these large regions, and there's 3 major regions. As you can see, Texas all by itself there. And so one of the issues was that this centralized grid structure lends itself to greater vulnerabilities because people aren't getting their energy locally, basically. So why is answering the question of why it's needed? There's dilapidated grid infrastructure. The centralized grid structure lends itself to vulnerabilities. There are frequent natural disasters in the Southeast US, the Gulf Coast, and these are becoming more frequent with climate change. So our policies to address that were respond to that were to upgrade the infrastructure, decentralize, and increase resiliency and decrease vulnerability. And so we had to get a bit more specific about how to do that. And so, and just a bit more background about this. There's a company in Louisiana and the Southeast US in general called Entergy, and they're responsible for the transmission and the grid infrastructure down there. But there are also different governing bodies. So I think you're aware of, at the national level, there's the president and the Congress. There's also the FERC, which is the Energy Regulatory Commission. So there's regulatory bodies that are responsible for things like energy transmission. Then there's also the state level, where you have the governor and the state congressional assemblies. And then there's also some state level regulatory commissions. And then at the local level, you have city council and other local politicians. and the mayor. And so if you're able to, we're going to do an activity where you can answer these questions. So the first question of like, who has jurisdiction to make these changes on the grid infrastructure in Louisiana and the Southeast US in general? If you could answer that question, type it in the chat, but don't send, and then take the time right now to type your answer to that in the chat, and then I'll count to one. Like at the end of my count, send it in. So 5. I don't know if everyone's ready, but I'll just start counting. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Any answers to who might have jurisdiction to make changes? Okay, yeah, that's a good guess. So that's considering like state level, the governor would have some authority in that. And we did think about the state level. We initially thought that we would be focusing our memo on state legislature, the state legislature, like the Congress, state Congress, and because they are able to set targets for energy. So we thought we would make them our audience, but we learned that the majority of people get their energy from Entergy, like I mentioned before, the company, and this is regulated by the Louisiana Public Service Commission. So it's still a state body, but it's a separate commission that has the ability to make its own laws for how energy is transmitted and distributed. And in particular, they had a law that that we ended up focusing on specifically. So the next question is, who or what is impacted by your policy? So in this case, who is impacted by the policy of the LPSC? So if you could, again, go to the chat, and I'll give you a few seconds to think about it, and who or what would be impacted by the policy that the LPSC, the Public Service Commission, would put into place. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, those are, I think there are a lot of people who would be impacted by this. So everyone in the region, Louisiana residents. One thing we also had to discuss was that Entergy, the company, would be impacted by this as well. They might, because our suggestion was that they remove so they took out a policy that incentivized people to build energy locally. So that would cut into the profits of, if people built more energy locally, it would cut into the profits of Entergy. So that private company would also be impacted, as well as the people in the region. But yeah, in general, more people would benefit from a more resilient and more updated grid. So
can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So on that initial map where you had like Louisiana was one of the whole eastern, southeastern region, is that the region we're talking about, or is it still, would there still be state by state commissions that have jurisdiction within that state?
Yeah, so there are state by state commissions. So this is basically a map of how the grids are
How the grid, yeah, okay.
How the grids are like physically interconnected. And so they are basically, Texas is just an island, pretty much. It's just had problems in the past couple of years with bad weather. But so yeah, the grid interconnection is something that can be regulated state by state, or like how people get their energy basically can be regulated state by state. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so this last one was what would be required to implement your policy. And so this is just kind of, I'm not going to have you guys, you don't need to answer this one, but it was just kind of talking about understanding changes to other laws that would need to be made for your policy to be effective, or like, you know, oversight that would need to occur for it to happen, financial things that would need to budgetary concerns that would need to be